Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is Natalia Solzhenitsyn. She's the widow of the Nobel Peace Prize laureate in literature, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're here because in Paris there are a series of events commemorating the 100th anniversary of Mr. Solzhenitsyn's birth. It is also the 10th anniversary of his death, and there is a number of events, including an exhibition at the Paris City Hall in the 5th arrondissement. And obviously you've kept his legacy alive, but I want to go back to when you met him. You met him in 1968, but actually, as many people maybe in the then Soviet Union, you actually met him before, in 1962.
That's true. I, like many other Russians, were looking forward to the 11th edition of the New World magazine because people were saying that it was going to publish something unusual. And when we received this magazine, which was simply dropped off in our mailboxes, when all of our relatives went to bed, we would gather in our tiny kitchens where we didn't have space for everything. I would put away the dishes, tidy up the table, sit down on a stool and start reading. And after I finished reading, I realized I had read the entire story. So then I sat down and I read it once again from beginning to end. And it was completely clear to me that a great talent, a great author had come into the world of Russian literature, that this is great literature, not simply political sensationalism. It was a great shock to me to realize that Russia once again had a new talent.
This became the first book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, describing the everyday life of prisoners in the then Soviet Union. The second time when his name really became worldwide famous was the publication here in France, actually, for the first time in 1973, of the Gulag Archipelago. This was, you already knew him at the time, but this was the biggest change in your life because you had actually to leave the Soviet Union.
Yes, of course. When the Gulag Archipelago was published in France, there was a massive attack on Solzhenitsyn and on our family. We had 3 small boys, and almost all day the phone was ringing. I couldn't sleep. These were difficult times for us. But it was actually before this when we had decided that we're ready for anything. Now, we were ready for the worst. We were ready for him to be sent to the camps because at the time his health was not very good. So the fact that he was sent to the West actually saved his life and allowed him to write The Red Wheel, a historic account of the Russian Revolution, which he had actually planned when he was an 18-year-old student.
Right, and clearly this was a shock also here in the West because his denunciation of the totalitarian nature of the Soviet system opened the eyes of many people who didn't really want to see it or believe it.
Actually, this is a very interesting question. Every time people tell me that Solzhenitsyn opened the eyes of the West. When we came to the West, we realized that before the publication of the Gulag Archipelago, there were over 30 books, 30 eyewitness accounts of the Gulag written by people who had been in the Gulag, who had escaped, and this had not created any kind of impression. So I think that the key to him opening people's eyes was the fact that this is great literature. It's a great art, and it is this art that opened people's eyes, and not that these facts were unknown previously. It's just people didn't want to see them.
Right. Obviously, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you returned to Russia in 1994. Since then, there has been criticism of the fact that he was a nationalist. There have been attacks against him, sometimes bordering on racism, anti-Semitism. Was it difficult for him and for you to face those attacks coming from the West, essentially?
Actually, this criticism began much earlier, before we returned to Russia, maybe 10 years earlier, when Alexander Solzhenitsyn published the full version of August 1914, where he described the events surrounding the murder of Prime Minister Stolypin. Solzhenitsyn believed that Stolypin was the greatest political leader in Russia of the 20th century, and we have not seen a greater leader in the 20th century. It was a great political figure. He was killed by Bagrov, a Jew from Kiev. And this fact, which was described in detail by Solzhenitsyn, was used to accuse him of anti-Semitism, and this is absurd. It's absurd.
There is also his relationship with the power in Russia. He had met then President Putin back in 2008, and he seems to have, and maybe you share this view, a rather positive view. Obviously, Vladimir Putin is often seen in very negative light here in the West. What was his take and your take on the Russian president?
Well, our relationship with the government actually didn't begin with Putin. It began with Gorbachev and with Yeltsin. And Solzhenitsyn was very critical of Yeltsin's foreign affairs, of his foreign policy. In 1999, when the U.S. was bombing Belgrade, this was a turning point for Russians. When we arrived in 1994, everyone was looking up to the U.S. as a model for democracy and freedom. No one was accepting our criticism of the U.S. I said that I had lived there for 18 years. It's a wonderful country, but it also has its problems. It's simply a country, and people would look at me as if I were a reactionary. But after the events of 1999, without UN support, the U.S. began to bomb Serbia. People really changed their perception of the U.S. And this is the same year when Yeltsin transferred power to Putin. Russia's foreign policy at the time also changed because of Putin. And these two events, this kind of disappointment in the United States, disappointment in the U.S.'s historical decisions, and the ascension to power of a young president who tried to bring Russia back into the family of equal nations, really played a big role. And Solzhenitsyn believed, as he said to President Putin, and I believe I can repeat it here, that after some time had elapsed, he said that he respects Putin's efforts to bring Russia back and to give Russia its proper role. But domestically, Solzhenitsyn did not think that Putin was able to accomplish very much, and he believed that much more needed to be done.
Just last question. One thing that we've seen in recent years is the rehabilitation of Joseph Stalin. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was sent to the Gulag at the end of World War II for criticizing Stalin. What's your reaction to
Я называю эту реабилитация не идет сверху.
I believe that this is not a top-down rehabilitation. This is a rehabilitation that is promoted by a portion of the population.
But
I believe this is a kind of protest-based love. I haven't seen any signs of that. The government is not opposed to this, but it's not supporting this rehabilitation. And this was not the case in the 90s. We didn't have this phenomenon. But when people realized that what they had been promised in the 90s didn't happen, when they realized that their lives were not improving, they thought that perhaps earlier things weren't so bad during Stalin's time. This is a kind of love out of protest. And it's mostly people who never lived during Stalin's times who expressed this love, who didn't know what it was like. I lived in the Soviet Union for 35 years before we were exiled, and then I spent 20 years in the West. Now I can say that modern Russia is not the Soviet Union. It is a completely different country. And as a result, there are some people whose views are different from my views or Solzhenitsyn's views. But Solzhenitsyn gave his life so that people would be able to speak their mind freely. Personally, it's very difficult for me to see monuments to Stalin going up. But I think that this is a problem related to growth, and Russia will overcome this.
Natalia Solzhenitsyn, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for coming on the France 24 set. And thank you for watching this edition of The Interview. Stay tuned for more news.